Stacey's a proud Wiradjuri woman. She's currently completing a PhD at Western Sydney University, where she's examining synergies between the governance structures within Australian universities, Indigenous leadership and outcomes in relation to higher education. Today, she'll be presenting on the perceptions of Indigenous academics in the Australian higher education system. Stacey will come online. She's actually online now to respond to any questions. So let's hit the play button.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for providing me with the opportunity to be able to present my research today. I have pre-recorded it, so I will share my screen, but I think we need the other screen.
Yeah, Amanda, could you please stop sharing your screen? Thank you.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Thank you. And I will get into it. As soon as I can. Here we go. Today I begin, but hang on a second, you shouldn't be able to see all of that. Hang on. You're just going to have to see
Today
all my
I
notes. Sorry.
begin by acknowledging the Dharawal speaking people who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which this presentation was produced, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples watching today. Today I'm presenting some of the findings from one component of a larger study that examined Indigenous leadership in higher education. The study was funded by the Australian Government through the Australian Research Council. Importantly, Professor Michelle Trudgett was the chief investigator, Professor Susan Page was the partner investigator, and I was assigned one component of the study, which formed the basis of my PhD. Before I talk specifically about the project, I just want to put it into context for you. If we look at the quote by Professor Mary Ann Binsalik, we can see that back in 2003, she called for all universities to have a senior Indigenous position. 14 years later, Universities Australia published the UA Indigenous 2017-2020 strategy. All universities signed off on the strategy, which clearly outlines a commitment to having at least one senior Indigenous role at each university. There are 39 universities in Australia. At present, 26 have a senior Indigenous position and 13 do not. It is important to note that a number of these positions are currently in recruitment stage and have no one in them, but there is a clear commitment to fill them. Of all the senior positions, we have 2 Deputy Vice-Chancellors, 19 Pro-Vice-Chancellors and 6 Deans. Noting University of South Australia has both a Dean and a Pro-Vice-Chancellor. In terms of the study, the overarching study specifically aimed to examine Indigenous leadership in higher education contexts, explore the roles, responsibilities and impacts of senior Indigenous appointments in Australian universities, and establish a model of best practice for the inclusion of Indigenous leadership in higher education governance structures. There were 2 phases to the project. Phase 1 has 5 stages of interviews. This included 3 recruitment professionals who had experience sourcing suitable Indigenous academics to undertake senior Indigenous positions, 14 senior Indigenous leaders, 31 university executives, 19 Indigenous academic staff, and 13 international First Nations leaders, giving a total of 80 participants. 59 interviews were conducted face-to-face and usually lasted an hour. The other 21 interviews were conducted via teleconference, video conference, and 1 participant provided responses in writing. All interviews were transcribed and data analysis was undertaken using the quality software program known as NVivo. A combined technique of deductive and inductive analysis was applied. The data pertaining to the interviews was initially coded using a deductive approach. This process involved establishing a number of descriptive categories that corresponded to the interview questions. Once coding categories were established and applied, the inductive analysis was undertaken. This involved reviewing the data a number of times and applying a code relating to an identified abstract concept. During this process, the data was collectively challenged, extended, supported, compared, and related to other concepts to ensure a deeper analysis. In terms of the participants within Australia, we spoke to people in every state and territory. In phase 2, Indigenous Student Success Program reports, strategic plans, and Indigenous higher education statistics were analysed to assess synergies between institutional rhetoric and outcomes in relation to Indigenous leadership in higher education. Every university in Australia is required to submit an ISSP report to the Commonwealth Government annually. The ISSP statements contain significant information pertaining to the funding for Indigenous students and staff. Additionally, the methodology for this project weaves together Indigenous standpoint theory and institutional theory. Today, I'm presenting some of the findings from stage 4 within phase 1 of the project. This stage included centering the voices of 19 Indigenous academic staff, ranging from the more junior level A associate lecturer academics through to level E academics, those being professors. Indigenous academics who participated in the study discussed their perceptions of Indigenous leadership across the Australian higher education sector. Upon analysing the interview transcripts, the perceived value, characteristics, and challenges of Indigenous leadership across the sector were identified. Indigenous academics considered 3 sets of values be critical to Indigenous leadership: visibility, voice, and advocacy, decision-making and action, and institutional accountability. In terms of visibility, voice, and advocacy, these words were related to having Indigenous representation at higher level meetings. Participants felt it was imperative that there was a senior Indigenous voice within their institution to promote the Indigenous agenda. However, while visibility, voice, and advocacy are important steps when communicating the voices of others, it can often fall short with regards to achieving results. Therefore, building upon this, decision-making and action were also key terms used to describe the value of senior Indigenous leaders. Indigenous academics believed that senior Indigenous leaders were perceived as being in a position to make decisions that benefit Indigenous peoples, thus allowing Indigenous agendas and policies to shift from purely a ticker box exercise to contributing to real change. While there was a strong consensus that senior Indigenous leaders are in a position to make decisions, take action, and drive change, participants believed such mechanisms adopted by senior Indigenous leaders allow them the opportunity to make the institution accountable. In terms of characteristics, Indigenous academics believe senior Indigenous leaders need to be resilient, be committed to the wider Indigenous community, and also have the ability to create and communicate a vision. When Indigenous academics spoke about Indigenous leaders needing to be resilient, 17 out of the 19 participants specifically related it to being resilient to the racism Indigenous leaders are faced with within the academy, a space they believe often discriminates towards Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous peoples. Looking at the commitment to the wider Indigenous community, all 19 participants believed Indigenous leaders needed to be committed to serving the educational goals of the wider Indigenous community. This included advocating for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges, decolonising theoretical perspectives, and engagement with Indigenous communities. Furthermore, in some cases, participants spoke about commitment in reference to repairing and strengthening the relationship between higher education institutions and Indigenous communities. This also extended to building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff while continuing to support Indigenous students. Comparably, vision and the ability to communicate the vision was the third most described characteristic reported by participants. Even within difficult circumstances, being visionary is essential to Indigenous leadership. However, developing a vision is only fruitful if it is shared with others. As such, visions need to extend across the wider organisation, or in this case, the broader higher education environment. The data indicated that leaders must be communicative in order to be able to inspire people to share their vision and have people invested in the bigger picture. Remarkably, key challenges senior Indigenous leaders are perceived to encounter include the significant scope of role, racism, and in some cases, the value of the role is not understood and considered tokenistic. In cases where there was a senior Indigenous leader at a university, Indigenous academics reported that the scope of the senior Indigenous leadership position was disproportionate when compared to other non-Indigenous senior leader positions. A number of participants went as far as describing the workload of their Pro-Vice Chancellor as horrendous. Some believe the role is too big, expressing that they observed the Indigenous Pro-Vice Chancellor role as having to undertake 4 or 5 roles into one. The majority of participants spoke strongly about racism being prevalent within the senior executive. When the subject of racism was discussed, it was in the context of a perceived challenge, and it wasn't necessarily in reference to being racist towards the Indigenous senior leader on a personal level. Rather, the racism observed by the Indigenous academics was broader and applied to anything Indigenous. Participants believed resistance was an expression of racism from non-Indigenous senior executive and staff. Non-Indigenous senior executives were observed to be resistant to executing Indigenous strategic plans. This was also attributed to non-Indigenous senior executive and staff being unwilling to support the objectives outlined within Indigenous strategies. Although senior Indigenous roles were perceived as an opportunity to make decisions, implement change, and hold higher education institutions accountable with regards to improving the educational outcomes for Indigenous peoples, some participants were seemingly sceptical, believing the role was tokenistic. In this sense, Indigenous academics believe the motivation for creating such a senior Indigenous position was simply symbolic to be inclusive of the Indigenous community. Participants who observed the role as tokenistic believe the senior Indigenous leaders were seen but not heard. Furthermore, participants also expressed their opinion that some universities only created an Indigenous Pro-Vice Chancellor role to meet the requirements of the ISSP funding. Looking at the implications and interconnections of these findings, Indigenous leadership in higher education is grounded in visibility, voice, and advocacy, as well as resilience and commitment to the wider Indigenous community. This leads to socially and culturally engaged institutions, Indigenous self-determination, and educational sovereignty. Through decision-making and action, institutional accountability, and being visionary and communicative. However, all of these things are severely impacted by the scope of role, racism and resistance from senior executive, and the tokenism of the role. To conclude, there are many positive aspects attributed to senior Indigenous leadership positions in higher education from the viewpoint of Indigenous academics. The characteristics required of people who hold these roles are certainly vast. The values of the positions are apparent both on the surface of institutional business right through to Indigenous educational sovereignty. Most alarming, though, is the challenges that people holding these positions face. These challenges have been shown to be beyond the scope of the university role itself and deep-seated in a manner that they become personal and emotional. This is no doubt because one's indigeneity is a key component of the position, which is ultimately designed to advocate for Indigenous Australians, both now and for many generations to come. Unlike any other senior executive position in a university, it requires a particular genealogy as well as a particular skill set. Indigenous leaders are required to remain committed and resilient while continuing to overcome adversity such as racism. Universities and government bodies have a social responsibility to ensure that the barriers underpinning these positions are removed and that every chance of success made available. Given the time limit for today's presentation, I haven't been able to present all the current findings related to the study. For those interested, please refer to the list of publications shown here for further information. As you can see, to date, there have been 6 articles published and 4 articles are currently in press. There are also a further 2 publications currently under review, and it is anticipated that they will be published early next year. Alternatively, please feel free to email me if you'd like to know more about the study. Thank you for listening.
I do apologise for the view. I'm not sure why it looked like that. But yeah, has anyone got any questions or?
Yeah. No, thank you very much for the presentation. And as always, the stats have changed already. We've got now
Yeah,
I
it's
think, 4
4.
DVCs out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I know. I pre-recorded that, and then as I was listening, like, oh, of course, it's 4 now.
Yeah.
Great news.
Yep. Yeah. No, it is good, and it's also good to see that a couple of them are in mainstream positions, not Indigenous specific positions as well.
That's right.
Okay. So, any questions come up?
No questions, just a couple of comments if you wanted to look at the
Chats.
yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Tom?
John, you may.
Yeah. Hi, Stacey, and thanks for such an amazing presentation. It's great to have a Western Sydney University presence today. So thanks for an amazing presentation. I just was wondering, have you had any thoughts about the role of elders in residence as part of Indigenous leadership in universities?
Yeah, it's interesting that you should ask that question. So we've actually just put Professor Trudgett, Professor Page and myself have just submitted an application that will be my postdoc to build on the Wailemeini study. And what the next phase will be is to look at our elders in residence and the leadership that they demonstrate and the role that they play in higher ed. So yes, that's part 2 of the next study that we hope to get up and running by the end of next year, providing that it all gets approved.
That's great, thank you.